All right, picking up where we left off last time, we were exploring the idea that if you take hydrogen and burn it, that of course causes an explosion. The result of that is the formation of water. That is because this is a redox reaction. It just so happens that as the electrons move, they're actually coupling together. But this has a large amount of energy release all at once. It's much better for us to harvest that energy along the way. So here, if we take hydrogen and we strip the electrons off of it, creating protons or two hydrogen anions, here we can take the electrons and we can pass them from one molecule to another molecule to another molecule to another molecule and on down the chain, and we can harvest the energy from those electrons along the way. Now, at the end, we will still go ahead and dump those electrons onto oxygen, which will attract the hydrogens and form water as one cohesive molecule. But we can harvest this energy a little bit more carefully and have less heat production and more formation of chemical potential energy. And this is essentially what we're doing. So if we look at the stages of respiration, it can be broken down into this process that we call glycolysis. This is where we take glucose and split it in half and turn it into two pyruvate molecules. There is something called the citric acid cycle. This is where we finish off the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide. And then there is a third step, which is what we call oxidative phosphorylation. And this is where we transfer electrons through a chain, ultimately leading to ATP synthesis. Now, as far as this chapter is concerned, this is the second most important diagram. If you understand this, you will be doing pretty good. So here we have these three processes: glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Here we have glucose. Glucose is being split into pyruvate. Pyruvate is then turned into acetyl-CoA, which enters into the citric acid cycle. Here we'll generate carbon dioxide. Both this process, glycolysis, and the citric acid cycle reduces NAD plus to NADH, and so NADH can carry these electrons over to here, and here the citric acid dumps them over here and puts them into something called the electron transport chain, and this will ultimately lead to oxidative ATP production. This is where we get the most ATP. Along the way, we do harvest a little bit more ATP. So here in glycolysis, we get a little bit. And over here in citric acid cycle, we also get a little bit. This is called substrate level ATP production. So if oxidative phosphorylation accounts for 90% of ATP, and this is powered by a chain of redox reactions, well, what is this substrate level phosphorylation? This is essentially the process where we have an enzyme that can take ADP and it can transfer phosphate onto it, producing ATP. Okay? So this process is more organized and uses a central ATP generator. This is just using a simple enzyme to do a one-off process. So as we produce ATP, most of it comes from here, a little bit comes from here, but all in all, we break down glucose into carbon dioxide and water. We are consuming oxygen along the way. And this can make up to 32 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose that we make. So again, with this process, this is by far the most important thing to remember. If you memorize this, you'll have gone a long way. But we also looked at the idea of what is a redox reaction. So we looked at the idea of something when it loses electrons is becoming oxidized. When something gains those electrons that have been lost, it becomes reduced. And we also explored the idea that instead of having one big explosive reaction, which is hard to harvest, we take those electrons and we pass them along a chain in order to slowly harvest that. Now, we are going to move on and add in one slight minor concept. Okay, so we'll call this 9.1.5. So organisms use high energy electrons to pump protons across a membrane to generate a biological battery. And this is called the proton motive force. So living cells require energy. Plants harvest that energy from light. Animals do that by eating the plants and utilizing the systems that we just referred to. If you look at this in a chemical standpoint, here we have organic molecules, and you add oxygen, and you burn those in animals, we can generate ATP and then produce carbon dioxide and water. In plants, we take that carbon dioxide and water and essentially utilize light energy to turn it back into organic molecules. So let's start breaking this down and simplifying because these two processes are remarkably similar. So the first thing we need to understand is that for this process to work, we have to have electrons, and not only do they have to be electrons, but they also have to be high energy electrons. Okay, so electrons on organic molecules tend to have a lot of energy associated with them, to where or electrons off of like water molecules don't have as much potential energy stored in them. So the source of these electrons we're going to call the electron donor. Okay, in our case, we harvest those from the breakdown of biological macromolecules that we've consumed. Now, when all of the extra energy that is present in here has been used, we have to put those electrons somewhere. And that final place that we drop the electrons is called the terminal electron acceptor. And in our case, it is oxygen. Now, the energy is harvested along the way utilizing this thing called the electron transport chain. As we pass the electrons along the parts of this chain, what it does is it causes physical movement which pumps protons across a membrane. If you've pumped protons across a membrane, we have both a chemical and electrical gradient generated, and this is in essence a biological battery. So here we have our system. We have some type of high energy electron donor. Those electrons are going to pass through an electron transport system and then ultimately dumped off to a terminal electron acceptor. So here we get our electrons from food, we break it down into carbon dioxide, and we gain these high energy electrons. We are ultimately going to dump those electrons off onto oxygen, which you can see here we have electrons high energy. These are now electrons low energy. The energy has been transferred in here. We now create water. This electron transport system takes protons and pumps them across a membrane to create a gradient. This is something that we call the proton motive force. This is a biological battery. This electrochemical gradient is then going to be utilized to do work. And that work could be chemical work, like making ATP. It could be transport work, getting stuff, or it could be mechanical work, like doing stuff. Now, um, the question may arise, do you have to use oxygen? Well, we do, but other organisms don't. So some bacteria can take organic sulfur and add those low energy electrons off and produce hydrogen sulfide. This is a gas that smells like rotten eggs. And this is what's being produced when you have actual rotting eggs. Now, in plants, what plants do is they actually take electrons off of water. Now, those electrons are low energy, as we've already defined over here. So what plants do is they take that low energy electron, add light energy, and turn it into a high energy electron. Now, once you do that, and you have these high energy electrons, you can then put them through an electron transport system and do all this stuff. But you can also utilize it to take carbon dioxide and turn it into food that you can use later. Now, some organisms don't even use either of these processes. What they actually do is essentially rust metal and take the electrons from there, right? There they typically dump it back off on the oxygen. So this process is remarkably similar. So here we have an electron transport chain, which is pumping protons. That is going to then create the proton motive force, this proton gradient. This is then going to pass through an ATP generator. So in us, it occurs in the mitochondria, and we pump protons into this inner membrane space. In chloroplasts, the same type of system still works, but we're pumping the protons into these thylakoid spaces. So it's a remarkably similar system. So, coming back to the concept of 9.1 organisms use high energy electrons to pump protons across a membrane to generate a biological battery, which is called the proton motive force. So again, electrons, high energy, we put them through this transport system, we pump protons in the process, that's how we harvest the energy, and then we dump them off onto oxygen to produce water. This electrochemical gradient can then be utilized to do things. This right here, if you understand this, will make this whole thing so much easier to understand. And later, if you decide to go to microbiology, where we're start exploring alternative metabolisms, it'll help there. In molecular biology and molecular cell biology, we'll come back to these principles again and again. So learning this is a very helpful paradigm.